The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Captain James Morrison, a decorated war veteran who had lost his right leg in Afghanistan. 3 years earlier, his military bearing remained unmistakable despite the prosthetic limb and the walking stick he now carried. James had traveled from his small Yorkshire village specifically to attend this ceremony. It held special meaning. For him, his younger brother Michael had been a member of the Queen's Guard before being killed in action overseas. Today marked the 3rd anniversary of Michael's death, and James wanted to honor his memory by witnessing the tradition his brother had loved so much. The crowd was thick with excited visitors from around the world. Families with children pointed cameras at the iconic red-coated guards standing motionless at their posts. The guards, known for their discipline and unwavering composure, remained statue-like despite the chatter and camera flashes around them. James positioned himself near the palace gates, his military medals visible on his chest. Several people noticed his decorations and nodded respectfully. Few tourists even approached him with questions about his service, which he answered politely but briefly. He preferred to let his presence speak for itself rather than draw attention to his sacrifices. The ceremony began with the familiar sound of military drums echoing across the palace courtyard. The precision and pageantry brought tears to James's eyes as he remembered watching similar ceremonies with Michael when they were children. Their father had been a career soldier. Both boys had dreamed of serving their country with honor, as the guards marched in perfect formation, their bearskin hats towering above the crowd. James felt a profound connection to the tradition and sacrifice they represented. These young men and women carried on a legacy that stretched back centuries. His brother had been proud to be part of that legacy. The crowd pressed closer as the ceremony reached its climax. James found himself squeezed between excited tourists, but he didn't mind. The energy was infectious, and for a moment, he forgot about the constant pain in his residual limb and the nightmares that still haunted his sleep. Behind him, however, trouble was brewing. A group of young men had been drinking heavily despite the early hour. They had started their day at a nearby pub and were now loud and disruptive. Their ringleader, a skinny punk with bright green hair and multiple facial piercings, seemed particularly aggressive. The punk, whose name was Danny Fletcher, had been in and out of trouble with the law since his teens. At 22, he had already accumulated a lengthy criminal record for petty theft, vandalism, and public disturbance. He harbored a deep resentment toward authority figures and particularly despised anything related to the military or police. Danny's friends were growing uncomfortable with his increasingly hostile behavior. They had come to London for a weekend of fun, but Danny seemed determined to cause problems. His alcohol consumption had amplified his natural aggression. He was looking for a target for his anger. As the ceremony continued, Danny's attention fixed on James. The sight of the war veteran's medals and military bearing triggered something ugly in the young man's intoxicated mind. He began making crude comments about soldiers and war heroes, loud enough for nearby tourists to hear and become uncomfortable. James tried to ignore the disturbance behind him, focusing instead on the beautiful ceremony honoring his brother's memory. But Danny's voice grew louder and more insulting. Other spectators began moving away from the group, sensing that trouble was approaching. The royal guards, maintaining their posts, had trained extensively to ignore distractions during ceremonies. Their discipline was legendary, and they had withstood everything from tourist provocations to severe weather without breaking character. However, several guards had begun to notice the disturbance in the crowd, though they remained outwardly impassive. Sergeant William Hayes, a 15-year veteran of the Guard, was stationed near where the commotion was building. Through years of experience, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when a situation was about to escalate from mere nuisance to genuine threat. His eyes, barely visible beneath his bearskin hat, tracked the movements of both the drunk punk and the war veteran. The ceremony was reaching its conclusion. When Danny decided to act on his drunken impulses, he pushed through the crowd toward James, his friends calling weakly for him to stop. The alcohol had stripped away whatever inhibitions he might have possessed, leaving only his resentment and desire to cause pain. James sensed the approach. but initially assumed it was just another tourist trying to get a better view. He had no way of knowing that his peaceful morning of remembrance was about to turn into something far more dramatic. The other tourists continued watching the ceremony. Unaware of the brewing confrontation, children pointed excitedly at the guards while their parents captured photos and videos. The contrast between the peaceful, celebratory atmosphere and the violence that was about to erupt could not have been greater. As Danny closed the distance between himself and James, his friends made one last attempt to pull him back, but he shrugged them off violently, nearly causing one to fall. His focus was entirely on the war veteran standing quietly with his walking stick. Watching the ceremony with obvious emotion, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only the Royal Guard's training and discipline, but also their humanity and sense of justice. What happened next would become a story that palace staff and witnesses would remember for years to come. A reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on distant battlefields, but in the streets of London itself. The morning that had begun as a peaceful tribute to a fallen hero was about to become something entirely different. Something that would reveal the true character of both those who serve and those who would attack the innocent. The ceremony was drawing to its magnificent close when Danny Fletcher made his move. With alcohol coursing through his system and hatred burning in his chest, he pushed past the final row of tourists separating him from Captain James Morrison. The war veteran remained focused on the ceremony, completely unaware of the danger approaching from behind. Danny's friends watched in horror as their companion stumbled forward with malicious intent. They had known him to be trouble, but this was different. This was crossing a line that decent people didn't cross. Tom, his closest friend since childhood, made one last desperate grab for Danny's arm, but missed. The attack came without warning. Danny shoulder-checked James from behind with surprising force for someone of his slight build. The war veteran, caught completely off guard and unsteady due to his prosthetic leg, stumbled forward violently. His walking stick flew from his grip, clattering across the cobblestones as he fought to maintain his balance. But Danny wasn't finished. As James turned around in confusion, trying to understand what had happened, the punk delivered a vicious shove with both hands. This time, the war veteran had no chance. He toppled backward, his prosthetic leg unable to provide the stability he needed. He hit the ground hard, his head striking the unforgiving stone with a sickening sound that caused several nearby tourists to gasp in shock. The ceremonial music continued, but the crowd in the immediate vicinity fell silent. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer as they realized they were witnessing an assault. Some reached for their phones to record the incident, while others looked around desperately for police or security. James lay on the cold cobblestones, momentarily stunned from the impact. His military medals, which had been proudly displayed on his chest, were now scattered and dirty. A thin line of blood began to trickle from a cut on his forehead where he had struck the ground, the walking stick that had helped him navigate. The world since losing his leg lay several feet away. Just out of reach, Danny stood over the fallen veteran, swaying slightly from the alcohol but grinning with satisfaction. In his twisted state of mind, he felt he had struck a blow against everything he hated about authority and tradition. He raised his voice, slurring his words as he began to shout insults at the injured man. "Look at the big war hero now, Danny," yelled his voice carrying across the stunned crowd. "Not so tough without your fancy uniform, are you? Just another cripple begging for attention with your shiny medals." The words hit James harder than the physical assault. He had endured 3 years of physical therapy, nightmares, and adjustment to his new reality. He had never asked for special treatment or played the victim card. He simply wanted to honor his fallen brother in peace. But now, lying helpless on the ground while this stranger hurled insults, he felt a humiliation deeper than any he had experienced on the battlefield. Several tourists began moving toward James to help him, but Danny turned on them aggressively, warning them to stay back. His friends, who had been frozen in shock, finally began moving toward him, trying to pull him away from the scene. But Danny shrugged them off again, intoxicated and angry. To listen to reason, The royal guards who had been part of the ceremony were faced with an unprecedented situation. Their training emphasized maintaining discipline and composure under all circumstances during official duties. They were not supposed to break character or leave their positions, except in the most extreme emergencies. But watching an innocent veteran being attacked mere yards from where they stood tested every instinct they possessed. Sergeant Hayes, still maintaining his rigid posture, was fighting an internal battle. Every fiber of his being wanted to help the fallen veteran, but years of training held him in place. His jaw was clenched so tightly beneath his bearskin hat that his teeth ached. Other guards were experiencing similar conflicts between duty and human decency. The crowd's murmur was growing louder as more people became aware of what was happening. A woman screamed as Danny kicked James's walking stick further away, clearly enjoying the veteran's helpless position. An elderly man shouted at Danny to stop, but the punk just laughed and threatened to attack him too. James tried to push himself up from the ground, but the combination of his prosthetic leg, the pain from his fall, and the awkward angle made it nearly impossible. His hands scraped against the rough cobblestones as he struggled, reopening old scars from his combat injuries. The sight of the war hero struggling on the ground while his attacker stood over him was becoming unbearable for everyone watching. Danny seemed to be gaining energy from the attention and the distress of the crowd. He began making crude jokes about disabled veterans and questioning James's service record. His words were becoming increasingly vile. Several people in the crowd were openly weeping at the cruelty of the assault. A businessman in an expensive suit stepped forward and demanded that Danny stop his attack. Instead of backing down, the punk turned his aggression toward this new target, shoving the man and threatening worse. It was becoming clear that Danny was completely out of control and posed a danger to anyone who tried to intervene. The situation had evolved from a simple assault to something far more serious. Danny's behavior was escalating, and innocent bystanders were now at risk. The crowd was growing agitated, with some people shouting for police, while others tried to move their families to safety. The peaceful ceremony had transformed into a scene of chaos and violence. James finally managed to prop himself up on one elbow, his military training helping him assess the tactical situation despite his pain and humiliation. He could see that the situation was spiraling out of control, and that innocent people might be hurt if something didn't change quickly. The royal guards continued to maintain their positions, but the tension was becoming unbearable. Several younger guards were visibly struggling with their training, their hands clenched into fists beneath their white gloves. The ceremony had officially ended, but they had not yet been dismissed to their regular duties. What happened next would determine whether this ugly incident would escalate into something even worse, or whether the discipline and honor that the royal guards represented would find a way to restore order and dignity to a situation that had descended into chaos and cruelty. Sergeant William Hayes had served in Afghanistan alongside men like Captain Morrison. He had seen good soldiers fall and had carried wounded comrades to safety under enemy fire. Watching a war veteran being brutalized by a drunken coward, just yards from where he stood, every instinct screamed at him to act. But his training and duty held him frozen in place like a statue. The other guards were experiencing similar torment. Private Jennifer Walsh, one of the newer members of the unit, felt tears threatening to break through her professional composure. She had joined the Queen's Guard to serve her country with honor, not to stand helplessly while innocent people were attacked. Her knuckles were white beneath her ceremonial gloves as she fought to maintain position. Lance Corporal Marcus Thompson, positioned near the palace gates, was calculating angles and distances. His military mind was automatically planning how he could reach the attacker in the fewest steps, how he could neutralize the threat while protecting the veteran and the crowd. But the weight of centuries of tradition and discipline kept his boots planted firmly on the cobblestones. The crowd's outrage was growing more vocal. Shouts of "Someone help him!" and "Where are the police?" echoed across the courtyard. A group of American tourists were recording everything on their phones, their commentary full of disbelief that such an attack could happen in broad daylight at one of London's most famous landmarks. Danny Fletcher, emboldened by what he perceived as his victim's helplessness, decided to escalate his assault. He grabbed Captain Morrison's walking stick from where it had fallen and raised it above his head like a weapon. The crowd gasped collectively as they realized he intended to strike the injured veteran with his own mobility aid. "This is what your precious war heroes are worth," Danny screamed, his voice echoing off the palace walls. Broken, useless, pathetic. It was at that moment that something unprecedented happened in the disciplined ranks of the Queen's Guard. Sergeant Hayes didn't make a conscious decision to move. His body simply acted on instincts deeper than training, older than tradition. His right foot shifted almost imperceptibly forward, breaking the perfect formation that had been maintained throughout the ceremony. The movement was subtle, but every guard noticed it immediately. In their world of absolute precision and discipline, even the smallest deviation was like a thunderclap. Ah! Private Walsh felt her heart race as she realized what was happening. Lance Corporal Thompson's breathing quickened beneath his bearskin hat. Captain Morrison, still struggling to rise from the ground, saw the walking stick raised above him and understood his situation had become life-threatening. His combat training kicked in, and he began calculating his options. Rolling to avoid the blow would be difficult with his prosthetic leg, but staying still meant accepting a potentially fatal beating. The crowd sensed the shift in atmosphere. Some people began backing away, fearing they might be caught in escalating violence. Others pressed closer, unwilling to abandon the veteran to his fate. An elderly woman began crying openly, reminding several observers of their own grandfathers who had served in various wars. Danny's friends, Tom and Kevin, finally overcame their shock and fear. They rushed toward their companion, shouting at him to stop. Tom grabbed Danny's arm just as he began to bring the walking stick down toward James's head. The two young men wrestled for control of the improvised weapon, with Kevin trying to wrap his arms around Danny's waist. "You've lost your mind, Danny," Tom shouted. "He's a war hero. What's wrong with you?" But Danny was beyond reason. The alcohol, the crowd, and his own festering anger had created a perfect storm of violence. He elbowed Tom in the ribs and broke free from Kevin's grip, still clutching the walking stick. His eyes were wild, unfocused, dangerous. Sergeant Hayes felt his discipline cracking like ice under pressure. He had watched enough. His second step was more obvious than his first, a clear movement toward the unfolding violence. Around him, other guards were beginning to shift their weight, their training warring with their humanity. A businessman in the crowd shouted at the guards, "For God's sake, do something. Your soldiers," his words carried across the courtyard, heard by guards who were already questioning everything they had been taught about duty and protocol. Private Walsh made her own decision. She had family members who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan. She couldn't stand by while one of their brothers was beaten with his own walking stick. Her foot moved forward, following Sergeant Hayes' lead. The movement created a ripple effect. Through the formation, Lance Corporal Thompson was torn between conflicting duties. His oath as a soldier included protecting innocent people from harm. His role as a Queen's Guard demanded perfect discipline and adherence to protocol. The two duties had never conflicted so directly before. Captain Morrison managed to roll partially onto his side, trying to present a smaller target while searching for something he could use to defend himself. The movement sent a spike of pain through his residual limb, but he had endured worse. His military training had taught him that survival often required pushing through pain that would stop civilian life cold. The crowd was becoming increasingly agitated. Some people were shouting for the guards to help, while others were calling for police. Few were trying to organize themselves to rush Danny as a group. But the presence of his friends complicated any civilian intervention. Danny raised the walking stick again, this time with clear intent to deliver a devastating blow. The crowd fell silent, except for a few gasps and whimpers. This was the moment that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives unless something changed immediately. Sergeant Hayes felt time slowing around him. He could see the trajectory of the walking stick, could calculate when it would make contact with Captain Morrison's head. He could see the terror in the crowd's faces, the desperation in the veteran's eyes. Most importantly, he could feel his own soul breaking at the thought of standing idle while evil triumphed over innocence. The next few seconds would determine not Just the fate of Captain Morrison, but the honor and conscience of every guard present. They had sworn to serve Queen and country, but in this moment, country was represented by a disabled veteran being beaten by a coward. The choice was becoming clear, even if the consequences were not. Breaking formation, the walking stick began its downward arc toward Captain Morrison's head when Sergeant Hayes made a decision that would change his military career forever. With a roar that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, he abandoned his position and charged toward Danny Fletcher. His heavy military boots thundered against the cobblestones as he covered the distance in powerful strides. The sound of Hayes breaking formation was like a dam bursting. Private Walsh immediately followed, her smaller frame moving with surprising speed as she sprinted toward the confrontation. Lance Corporal Thompson was right behind her, along with 3 other guards who had decided that some things mattered more than protocol. Danny turned at the sound of approaching boots, his alcohol-impaired reflexes too slow to process what was happening. He saw the red-coated figures bearing down on him and felt a moment of pure terror. These were not ordinary security guards or police officers. These were elite soldiers, whose training and discipline were legendary throughout the world. Sergeant Hayes reached Danny first. With precision born from years of combat experience, he grabbed the punk's wrist and twisted, forcing him to release the walking stick. The improvised weapon clattered harmlessly to the ground as Hayes spun Danny around and forced him face first against the palace wall. "You picked the wrong veteran to attack, son," Hayes growled in Danny's ear,
Oh.
his voice carrying the authority of 15 years of military service.
Ow.
"And you definitely picked the wrong place to do it." Private Walsh immediately knelt beside Captain Morrison, her training in battlefield first aid taking over. She quickly assessed his injuries while speaking in gentle, reassuring tones. "I'm Private Walsh, sir. We're going to take care of you. Can you tell me where you're hurt?" James looked up at the young guard with gratitude and amazement. "My head hit the ground pretty hard," he managed to say, "but I think I'm okay. Thank you for helping me." Lance Corporal Thompson positioned himself between the crowd and the arrest, ensuring that tourists stayed at a safe distance while his colleagues handled the situation. His presence alone was enough to maintain order. The sight of a Queen's guard in full ceremonial dress commanded immediate respect and obedience. Danny's friends, Tom and Kevin, stood frozen in shock. They had never seen the Royal Guards break formation before. The discipline and authority these soldiers displayed was unlike anything they had encountered. Tom began apologizing frantically, trying to distance himself from Danny's actions. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as they realized what had happened. The guards had chosen justice over protocol, humanity over regulations. Children who had been crying in fear now smiled and waved at the soldiers who had become their heroes. Adults wiped tears from their eyes as they witnessed something truly extraordinary. Sergeant Hayes maintained his grip on Danny while speaking into his radio. "Control, this is Hayes. We have a situation at the main gate. Need immediate police response and medical assistance. 1 injured veteran, 1 perpetrator. In custody, response was immediate and professional. Within minutes, Metropolitan police officers were on scene, along with paramedics to check on Captain Morrison's injuries. The efficiency of the response showed how seriously any incident near the palace was treated. As police officers took custody of Danny, he finally seemed to understand the magnitude of what he had done. The alcohol was wearing off, replaced by the cold reality of his situation. He had assaulted a war veteran at Buckingham Palace while the entire incident was recorded by dozens of tourists. His criminal record would ensure serious consequences. Captain Morrison refused to be taken to the hospital, insisting his injuries were minor. Boom! The paramedics cleaned the cut on his forehead and pronounced him fit to remain at the scene. He was more concerned about the guards who had helped him than his own condition. "Sergeant Hayes," James called out as the police finished their initial interviews, "I need you to know that what you did today was extraordinary. You and your team showed more honor in those few minutes than most people display in a lifetime." Helped the veteran to his feet and retrieved his walking stick, examining it carefully to ensure Danny hadn't damaged it. "Sir, you served your country with distinction and sacrifice. Couldn't stand by and watch you be attacked. Some things are more important than standing at attention." The other guards nodded in agreement. Private Walsh spoke up, her voice filled with emotion. "My uncle served in Afghanistan, sir. He always said that soldiers look after each other whether they're wearing the same uniform or not." The crowd was still gathered, many people taking photos and videos of the guards interacting with the veteran. The images would soon spread across social media, showing the world a different side of the famously stoic Royal Guards. These were not just ceremonial figures, they were real soldiers with hearts and consciences. A news crew had arrived and was setting up their equipment. The reporter, a veteran journalist who covered royal events regularly, approached Sergeant Hayes for an interview. Hayes politely declined, explaining that he would need to speak with his commanding officers before making any public statements. Captain Morrison turned to address the crowd that had witnessed the entire incident. His voice carried clearly across the courtyard as he spoke about the character of the guards who had protected him. "These soldiers represent the very best of our nation," he said. "They chose to do what was right, even when it meant breaking the rules they've sworn to follow." The tourists applauded again, many of them visibly moved by the veteran's words. Several people approached him to shake his hand and thank him for his service. Children who had been frightened by the violence now saw him as a hero who had been rescued by other heroes. As order was restored and the crowd began to disperse, the guards faced the reality of what they had done. They had abandoned their ceremonial posts to intervene in a civilian altercation. Their actions were justified morally, but military justice operated by different standards than civilian morality. Sergeant Hayes gathered his team together as they waited for their commanding officer to arrive. He could see the mixture of pride and concern in their faces. They had done the right thing, but they all understood that consequences would follow. The Queen's Guard was built on centuries of tradition and discipline, and they had shattered that tradition in full view of the public. But as they looked at Captain Morrison, now standing upright, with dignity restored, surrounded by grateful tourists and fellow veterans who had emerged from the crowd to support him, they knew their choice had been the only one they could live with. Colonel Elizabeth Hartwell arrived at Buckingham Palace within 30 minutes of the incident. As the commanding officer of the Guard Regiment, she had received detailed reports from both police and palace security, but she needed to assess the situation personally. The sight that greeted her was unlike anything in her 25 years of military service. Sergeant Hayes and his team stood at attention, their ceremonial uniforms slightly disheveled from the confrontation, but their bearing still impeccably military. Around them, tourists continued to take photos and approach with words of praise. Captain Morrison remained nearby, having refused to leave until he could personally thank each guard who had helped him. Colonel Hartwell's first instinct was to order her soldiers to return to their barracks immediately for debriefing. Breaking formation during a ceremonial duty was a serious breach of protocol that could result in court-martial proceedings. But as she observed the scene and listened to witness accounts, she began to understand the complexity of the situation. Her guards had faced Sergeant Hayes, she said formally, report on the incident. Hayes provided a crisp, professional summary of events. Taking full responsibility for the decision to abandon formation and intervene, he made no excuses and offered no justification beyond the basic facts. A war veteran had been under attack. They had acted to protect him. The colonel listened without interruption, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. Around them, the crowd had grown quiet, sensing the importance of this military moment. Many tourists understood they were witnessing something significant. Even if they didn't fully grasp the military implications, Captain Morrison stepped forward, his walking stick clicking against the cobblestones. "Colonel, if I may," he said, respectfully. "These soldiers acted with extraordinary courage and honor. Without their intervention, I might have been seriously injured, or worse. They are a credit to your unit and to the military." Colonel Hartwell studied the veteran with sharp eyes, taking in his medals, his bearing, and the obvious sincerity of his words. She recognized a fellow professional soldier, someone whose opinion carried weight. But military discipline wasn't. subject to civilian approval, no matter how well-intentioned. "I appreciate your words, Captain Morrison," she replied formally. "However, these soldiers have training and protocols they are expected to follow, regardless of circumstances." The tension in the crowd was palpable. People who had cheered the guards' heroic actions now worried they might face punishment for doing the right thing. Several tourists began approaching the colonel, eager to provide witness testimony supporting the guards' actions. An elderly gentleman who identified himself as a retired Royal Navy captain spoke up. "Colonel, I witnessed the entire incident. These guards faced an impossible choice between military protocol and basic human decency. They chose honor, and that choice saved a good man from serious harm." More voices joined in support of the guards. A mother with 2 young children explained how frightened her family had been until the guards intervened. A businessman described the escalating violence and Danny's clear intent to cause serious injury. Each account reinforced the same conclusion. The guards had faced a genuine emergency requiring immediate action. Colonel Hartwell raised her hand to quiet the crowd. "I understand everyone's feelings about this incident," she said clearly. "But military justice operates under different standards than civilian opinion. These soldiers will be subject to formal review of their actions." The announcement caused murmurs of disappointment and concern throughout the gathered tourists. Many began discussing whether they could contact officials or media outlets to advocate for the guards. The idea of punishing soldiers for protecting a veteran struck them as fundamentally wrong. Private Walsh stepped forward slightly, her voice respectful but firm. "Ma'am, we understood the potential consequences of our actions. But we couldn't watch a brother veteran be beaten while we stood idle. Some duties transcend protocol." Her words resonated with the other guards, who nodded in agreement. They had made their choice with full knowledge of the possible consequences, and none of them expressed regret for their actions. Meanwhile, news of the incident was spreading rapidly through social media. Videos taken by tourists were being shared, thousands of times, with overwhelmingly positive reactions from the public. The hashtag Guards of Honor began trending as people expressed admiration for the soldiers who had chosen conscience over protocol. Colonel Hartwell was receiving calls and messages from superiors who were monitoring the developing story. The incident was generating significant media attention, and the military's response would be scrutinized carefully. Public opinion was clearly supportive of the guards, but military discipline couldn't be subject to popular vote. Captain Morrison approached the colonel privately, speaking in low tones that others couldn't hear. "Colonel, I've served in 3 combat deployments. I know what real soldiers look like, and I know what honor means. These guards displayed both today. Whatever consequences they face should reflect that truth." The veteran's words carried the weight of shared experience and professional respect. Colonel Hartwell had served in combat zones herself and understood the bonds that connected soldiers across units and services. The decision facing her was becoming more complex by the hour. Danny Fletcher, now in police custody, was facing multiple charges including assault, disturbing the peace, and public intoxication. His friends had provided statements confirming that the attack was unprovoked and that the guards had shown remarkable restraint in their response. Even Danny's own companions supported the guards' actions. As the afternoon progressed, media crews arrived to cover the story. The incident was being portrayed as a positive example of soldiers choosing humanity over rigid protocol. International news outlets picked up the story, praising the British Royal Guards for their compassion and moral courage. Colonel Hartwell found herself caught between competing pressures. Military tradition demanded that she discipline soldiers who had abandoned their posts regardless of their motives, but public opinion, witness testimony, and her own professional judgment all supported the guards' actions as necessary and justified. The guards themselves remained stoically professional, accepting whatever consequences their actions might bring. They had served with honor for years and were prepared to face the results of their moral choice. Their dignity in the face of uncertainty only increased public admiration for their character. As evening approached, Colonel Hartwell prepared to make decisions that would affect not only her soldiers' careers, but potentially the public's perception of military justice and honor. The eyes of the nation, and increasingly the world, were watching to see how the British military would respond. Two soldiers who had chosen compassion over protocol. 3 days after the incident, Sergeant Hayes and his team were summoned to a formal hearing at Wellington Barracks. They had spent the intervening time on administrative duties while their actions were reviewed by military officials. Attention had continued to grow, with news outlets around the world covering the story of the guards who chose compassion over protocol. Captain Morrison had used his time to write letters to every military official he could identify, providing detailed testimony about the guards' professionalism and heroism. Veteran organizations across the United Kingdom had rallied to support the guards, arguing that their actions represented the highest traditions of military service. The hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m., a formal conference room normally reserved for high-ranking officers. Sergeant Hayes led his team into the room, where they found not only Colonel Hartwell, but also several senior officers they didn't recognize. The atmosphere was formal and intimidating. What none of them expected was the presence of additional figures at the head table. A representative from Buckingham Palace sat alongside the military officials, along with a man in civilian clothes who was later identified as a senior advisor to the Prime Minister. The significance of such high-level attention was not lost. On the guards, Colonel Hartwell called the hearing to order with military precision. Sergeant Hayes, you and your team are here to answer for your actions during ceremonial duty on Tuesday morning. You abandoned your posts and broke formation to intervene in a civilian incident. How do you answer to these charges? Hayes stood at attention, his voice clear and steady. Ma'am, we acknowledge that we left our positions during ceremonial duty. Our actions were in response to an immediate threat to a disabled veteran who was under violent attack. We accept full responsibility for our choices. The formal questioning continued for nearly an hour. Each guard was asked to provide their account of events and to explain their decision-making process. Their answers were consistent, professional, and showed no regret for their actions despite the potential consequences. During a brief recess, the guards could hear crowds gathering. Outside Wellington Barracks, word of the hearing had leaked to the media, and supporters had come to demonstrate their backing for the soldiers. Veterans in wheelchairs, military families, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by the story were all present. When the hearing resumed, Colonel Hartwell's demeanor had changed subtly. She stood and addressed the guards with a tone that suggested the proceedings were taking an unexpected turn. Sergeant Hayes, Private Walsh, Lance Corporal Thompson, and the rest of your team, she began formally. The review of your actions has been completed. What you did was unprecedented in the modern history of the Queen's Guard. The guards braced themselves for disciplinary action, but Colonel Hartwell's next words left them stunned. However, after extensive consultation with senior command, review of all witness testimony, and consideration of the extraordinary circumstances you faced, it has been determined that your actions demonstrated the highest values of military service. You chose to protect an innocent veteran from serious harm, showing courage, quick thinking, and moral clarity under pressure. The palace representative stood and addressed the room. Her Majesty has been personally briefed on this incident. The Queen wishes to express her admiration for soldiers who embodied the true spirit of service, protecting those who have already sacrificed for their country. Your actions reflected great credit on the crown. Sergeant Hayes felt his legs weaken. With relief, round him, his team exchanged glances of amazement and gratitude. They had expected court-martial proceedings, not royal approval, but the surprises weren't finished. The Prime Minister's advisor stepped forward with a formal document. By order of Her Majesty's government, each of you is to be awarded the Queen's Commendation for bravery. Your actions demonstrated exceptional courage in protecting a vulnerable member of the public from serious harm. The room erupted in applause. From the senior officers present, what had begun as a disciplinary hearing had transformed into a recognition ceremony. The guards stood in formation. Overwhelmed by the unexpected honor, Colonel Hartwell smiled for the first time since the incident. Additionally, Sergeant Hayes, you are being promoted to Staff Sergeant, effective immediately. Your leadership in this situation showed exceptional judgment and moral courage. Outside the barracks, the crowd had grown to several hundred people. When news of the hearing's outcome reached them, cheers could be heard throughout the building. Captain Morrison, who had been waiting anxiously with other supporters, broke down in tears of joy. The palace representative had one final announcement. Her Majesty has requested that all of you participate in a special ceremony next week, where you will be formally recognized alongside Captain Morrison for your respective service to the nation. Private Walsh wiped tears from her eyes, struggling to maintain her military bearing. The young soldier who had feared her career was over was now being honored by the monarch herself. The other guards were similarly emotional, overwhelmed by the support they had received as the formal proceedings concluded. The guards were escorted outside to meet with the gathered crowd. Captain Morrison was the first to approach them, his walking stick clicking against the pavement as he moved as quickly as his prosthetic leg would allow. "I told you these were extraordinary soldiers," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Today proves that doing the right thing still matters, even in a world that sometimes seems to have lost its way." The media coverage that followed was overwhelmingly positive. News outlets around the world reported on the royal guards who chose humanity over protocol and received royal recognition for their moral courage. The story became a symbol of hope, showing that individual conscience and compassion could still triumph over rigid bureaucracy. Danny Fletcher, meanwhile, was convicted of assault and sentenced to 6 months in jail along with community service. His attack on a disabled veteran, recorded by multiple witnesses, generated no public sympathy. His friends testified that they had tried to stop him, and they received suspended sentences for their minor roles in the incident. The special ceremony at Buckingham Palace a week later drew international attention. Captain Morrison received a civilian award for his military service and his grace in handling the attack. The guards were formally presented with their commendations by senior royal officials. In his speech at the ceremony, Captain Morrison reflected on what the incident had taught him about the enduring power of human decency. "These soldiers reminded me why I served in the first place," he said. "Not for politics or glory, but to protect a way of life that values courage, compassion, and doing what's right even when it's difficult." The story became part of Royal Guard lore, passed down to new recruits as an example of how military discipline and human conscience can work together rather than in opposition. The guards involved became legends within their regiment, proof that true honor sometimes requires breaking the rules. Years later, Sergeant Hayes, by then promoted again to company sergeant major, would tell new guards that the most important lesson of his career came from that morning at Buckingham Palace. "We serve Queen and country," he would say, "but we serve humanity first. Never forget that the uniform doesn't make you a soldier. Your choices do." Captain Morrison remained friends with the guards who had helped him, attending their promotions and celebrating their achievements. The walking stick that Danny had tried to use as a weapon was eventually donated to a military museum, where it stands as a symbol of how courage can triumph over hatred. The incident changed everyone involved, proving that even in our modern, cynical world, individual acts of heroism can still inspire nations and remind us of our better angels.